This is, of course, an extremely topical issue at the eve of Trump's visit to Brussels tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday. It is all the more a pleasure as we share this panel with three top-level colleagues from our partner institution, the Institute voor Europese Studies of our sister university, the VUB, and one of our former presidents, Professor Mario Telò. As you will have understood from the program, the idea is to approach this transatlantic solidarity issue in an interdisciplinary manner. First, Mr. Karel de Gucht, who is, of course, well known by all of you, will address this question from a geoeconomic angle. As you know, Karel de Gucht served as Belgium's Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2004 till 2009, and then as European Commissioner for Trade from 2010 to 2014. Mr. de Gucht, it's a real pleasure to welcome you here at the Institut d'études européennes of the ULB as President of the Institute voor Europese Studie of the VUB. Then Professor Mario Telò will approach the topic from an additional angle. Professor Mario Telò is professor here at the ULB, but also at the Luis Carli University in Rome, and is president of the academic board of the H2020 Gemstones project. Richard Higgot, professor of diplomacy at the Vesalius College and research professor at the IES, will tackle transatlantic solidarity from a diplomatic perspective. Prof. Higgot is an old friend of this institute, as he collaborated with us, for instance, in the Green Project, but also in Garnet Project. And the last angle that will be examined is security and the military. This will be the task of Alexander Mattelaer. Alexander Mattelaer is professor also at the IES and director for European affairs in the Egmont Institute. So this being said, I give you the floor for maximum 12 minutes each. So thank you very much, Professor Karel de Gucht. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and it's not the first time I'm here, you know. I've been here before. Many years ago when I studied just in front of this building and also afterwards. But let me try to say very briefly something about the geoeconomic aspects of the transatlantic relationship. And first of all, I believe that trade is always geoeconomic. I mean, it's not simply about selling and buying things. It has an impact. In 1914, so beginning of the First World War, where we had a very open international market, by the way, world trade was at 16% of world GDP. Now it's more than double that percentage. And what is more, 100 years ago, goods were produced in one country, merely, and they were bought in another one. And today, the vast majority of products we use every day are a mix of components, logistics, services, delivered by workers all over the world. And each product that you sell has about 50% of imports in it. So the whole makeup of trade has changed. So now each country and each bloc, talking about Europe, depends on finding and winning its place in these regional and global value chains. And that demonstrates very well that this has a geostrategic relevance, of course. What I see is that trade is used more and more like a tool to create and maintain spheres of influence in the world, fed by a balancing act of both cooperation and competition. And look at this whole story about from China on the Silk Roads, the new Silk Roads over land and over sea. That's very clearly it's about spheres of influence of China. Now let me turn to the partnership between the EU and the US. It has always a special, obvious one. It's rooted in shared values of freedom, human rights, democracy, and a belief in the market economy. And the economic bond between the two is perhaps the most defining feature of the relationship. The economic integration is broader and deeper than between any other political region in the world. A long shared history of trade and intellectual exchange and a similar rate of economic development has led to this close and commercially significant relationship. It's more than significant. The trade between Europe and the United States represent on a daily basis more than $2 billion or euros. They are very close to each other now. And the transatlantic relationship, it's also a driver of global economic growth. This shows that the economies of the EU and the US are so intertwined and interdependent, which gives space for cooperation and a healthy level of competition. At first glance, Europe's unique single market, its political stability, enlargement, attractiveness for foreign investment, and even the launch of the euro can be seen as a direct threat to the US global economic dominance. The US, in turn, is rich, politically and militarily powerful, and has dominated the world order, including setting it since seemingly forever. Still, traditionally, the EU and the US collaborate on far more than what they compete on. Now, as Daniel Hamilton and Steve Blockmans rightly underline in their paper on the geostrategic implications of TTIP, taken together, these elements underscore that TTIP is not just another trade agreement. It's a new generation negotiation aimed at repositioning the EU and the US for a more diffuse world of intensified global competition. So TTIP can be a benchmark for future global standards, but TTIP has come to a halt. And I would say common wisdom, but never trust common wisdom, because wisdom can never be common. It's common wisdom that it is because of Trump that we do not continue now with the negotiation on TTIP. That's completely false. In fact, the negotiation on TTIP, the real negotiation, has stopped somewhat, well, very close, very soon, about 4 years ago, in the summer of 2013, because the United States, under Obama, didn't agree to reciprocate the offer that we had been doing on public procurement, although they had promised so in the white paper before that we had drafted before the negotiation. Now, public procurement is essential in such a deal, because if you want such a deal being accepted in Europe, you need a good package of public procurement. If not, you never convince, for example, the French to give in on agriculture. It's very simple, I mean. So by, in fact, not reciprocating on public procurement, this effectively halted the negotiations. So it's not Trump that had to stop them. They were stopped. I mean, we continued discussing on a number of issues on regulatory approximation and in a positive way, but the clue, let's say, to be able to clinch a deal was missing already for quite some time. Now, nevertheless, I mean, in the present situation, we should stick together, because we still have this very important trading relationship with the US, and I don't think that much is going to change about that relationship. My opinion on Trump is that he is an accident de parcours. And it's not the first time that I'm saying this. I mean, I wrote it already in a contribution the day of his inaugural speech, which was about the most horrible speech I have ever heard from a world leader, you know. Even now it was more positive. So it was really, I really believe he's an accident de parcours. And what is very interesting, look at what is being said by the administration on the EU-US relationship. Nothing. They are very unhappy with NAFTA. They say that they are going to impose heavy duties on China until the moment that Xi Jinping himself comes to the US, and then Trump all of a sudden has a different opinion on that. But on Europe, they say rarely anything. And I've been, by the way, putting this question directly to Wilbur Ross, who is the Commerce Secretary, and he said, we haven't made up our mind yet about that, you know. Which is, I think, true. They don't know what they are exactly going to do with it, and they realize that, in fact, they can do very little. No? There is now an anti-dumping case against Belgian steel. You never know in steel business, that's something else. But generally speaking, this trade continues as it was. Nothing has changed. No? Now, when you look a little bit more closely to what they have in mind, it's interesting reading the recently published National Trade Policy Agenda for 2017, and that can give us some indication of the direction the US wants to go. And the aim is to increase economic growth, promote job creation in the US, promote reciprocity with trading partners, strengthen the US manufacturing base, expand agriculture and other exports. Now, all countries have the same goals, no? Even the former US administration. The aim, however, is that you read that you need to sustain the growth, and by looking internally, you will not find it. Look at China, who eventually also realized the benefits of going global. Imagine that everybody starts exporting more. Who is going to absorb those exports? You can only export more if you also import more on a global basis, very clearly. Reciprocity with trading partners, we also try to do that by trade defense instruments and also by, for example, the ITI, the International Trade Instrument, that hopefully very soon will be voted by the Council of Ministers. I introduced it more than 3 years ago. Of course, we want more jobs. Everybody wants more jobs, and everybody wants more economic growth. But the formula that they are putting forward as something that is unilateral can never work. I mean, this it's a conundrum. No? Now, the idea of President Trump wanting to focus on fair trade instead of free trade makes you, of course, wonder what he means by this. What does it mean, fair trade? Obviously, he is not talking about upholding international standards on the environment, on human rights, climate change, green goods, renewables. No, I assume for him, fair trade is that of assuring the fairest treatment of the US in the relationship. Okay, but that's not what is generally considered to be fair trade. So he is again changing the concepts. You know, he is not bad in that. Now, the underlying fact is this. It's not how you run the second biggest world economy, not if you wish to retain the title. Threatening countries, companies and investors into submission never gives sustainable results or dependable partnerships. If President Trump limits imports to the US, he cannot expect to export with the same level of access to the world market. Reciprocity is a rule. It's a WTO rule, valued by an integrated world economy. You have to import to export, and one does not come without the other. Also, President Trump's idea of revising and renegotiating trade deals is just ridiculous, not to mention insulting to the partner, time-consuming, and will never be better than that was accomplished in the first run. It's a common courtesy not to go back on a deal unless there is evidence of abuses and term violations. President Trump, as a businessman, should know this. It seizes credibility and sets a bad precedent for opening up agreements, and not only trade-related ones. The beauty of a negotiation is that it's always a give-and-take relationship, to compromise in one area but to gain in another. I can promise you that the US would never close a trade deal if there were no gains or it was detrimental to the Americans. Look at the speed of the TTIP negotiations. The Buy American, the Buy American clauses on public procurement, on lifting tariffs and harmonizing legislation on agriculture are real stumbling blocks. So trust me when I say that a trade deal with the US is rarely detrimental to the USA, and understandably so. Now, President Trump's shunning of WTO and international obligations is more worrisome. If he decides to ignore the rules or uphold values then what leverage is there to keep others, like China or Russia, in line with the WTO international obligations? And we must raise questions when the National Trade Policy Agenda for 2017 explicitly states that if a WTO dispute settlement report is adverse to the US will consult whether to implement the recommendations or not. So if it's a good report, then it's okay. How do you learn that? And what precedent or example does it set for others? It would become hypocritical for the US to hold others accountable if it doesn't want to be held accountable itself. This is dangerous, and it will take the WTO irrelevant. It will make, the WTO irrelevant. Not to mention what does this mean for other international or UN agreements and bodies. It only demonstrates that we are going to see an aggressive US defending its American sovereignty over trade policy. And it is the responsibility of the rest, especially Europe, to provide and show the alternative, that free trade, respect for WTO rules and setting international standards on human rights, the environment and labour is the future of trade. Where the US leaves the gap, the EU must step in. The EU cannot leave space for others, like China, to swoop in and set their own standards, undoubtedly of a lower caliber than what the EU advocates. Europe must start taking its leadership role in international trade, not wait or follow the US, act as one, or it is risking to lose its geostrategic advantage, its sphere of influence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I immediately give the floor to Professor Telò. Mario,
yes,
you have the floor.
thank you very much. Very challenging title, Transatlantic Solidarity from Geostrategic Partnership to Competition, question mark. Very challenging title, and I have only 4 points. My first point is really to understand which will be the consequence on the transatlantic relation of what I call a global change, which is occurring since several years, even before the start of the financial crisis. However, the financial crisis and the multipolarity, the multipolar world structure with the emergence of China, India, and so on, are the two main elements, two main factors explaining, in my opinion, this global change which is occurring. And we need research about that. We have a very interesting global debate in Asia, in Latin America, in the US, in Europe, about this the global change which is occurring. I call it in my last book a critical juncture, according to the historical institutionalist perspective, where really the institution of global governance will be reset, including the regional institution like the European Union and the interregional cooperation like the transatlantic cooperation and even the transatlantic trade, which was addressed by Professor de Gucht. For defining this global change, new concepts are addressed, which should be considered by the academic community with attention. I much to my surprise, in the last 2 months, we have had 2 important conferences on these topics. One with Amitav Acharya, former president of the International Studies Association, Indian professor in Washington. However, he's a constructivist, and he used the concept of a crisis of the global liberal order, started in 1945. And much to my surprise, the same concept was used by one of the most relevant pupils of the Bob Keohane School in the United States, the New Institutionalist School, John Eikenberry, in another conference, which used exactly the same concept, while coming from a completely different approach, a different perspective, as the future of the post-liberal order is concerned. So this is a very important element. What do we mean by that? We mean that Donald Trump is a consequence. It's not a cause, first of all. Donald Trump is a dramatic change. I don't think it's a pure accident de l'histoire, accident de parcours, because I will say why. But Donald Trump is part of the political consequence of the social implication of this great transformation which is occurring. Already yesterday I focused on one of the key elements of this transformation, the rising new economies, in particular China and India, which have overcome the Western economies already in 2007 in terms of parity purchasing power. This is a very, very interesting change in terms of share of the GDP, global GDP, and has an implication in Western countries. And what is interesting in the debate with Richard, which is expert on Asia, what is global and what is Western under this respect. In my opinion, there is a Western specificity because the Western working class and the Western middle class, both in the United States and Western Europe, including the UK, were particularly affected by this global change because of the downgrading economic condition and the emergence of insecurity, fears of the consequence of globalization, diminishing revenues, and flows of migrations. So in this context, we have a similar political cycle in the United States and Western Europe, which is difficult to explain only focusing on the Eurozone. We cannot say that Germany is responsible for everything, even of the victory of Donald Trump. So the global explanation, the global explanatory factor is much more relevant in my opinion. And we have to make a research, comparative research on United States and Europe under this respect. Why? Because the same political cycle is translated in two different issues. Because on the one hand, Donald Trump won in the United States, and on the other hand, Macron won in France. The Wilders was defeated in Holland, and Hofer was defeated in Austria. And in Germany, the issue at stake is whether we have a pro-European Merkel or a pro-European Schulz, with different accent, but this is the situation. So similar political cycle, because we have riots of marginalized, unemployed, and marginalized middle class, but different political consequence in terms of political power, the people who is in office. So the trend is different in Western Europe and in the United States. So we can have reasonable hopes that 2007 is stopping the black wave in Western Europe. Whereas in the United States for 4 years, we will have this completely different situation, and UK is more similar to the United States. Well, the political consequence will be very, very different. That is the reason why I don't totally agree with the Gucht regarding the accident, the parcours. Look at the last issue of Foreign Affairs. John Eikenberry presents the opposite thesis, that really Donald Trump is radically changing the American foreign policy since 50 years. So the three main concepts of the American foreign policy are in question. As you said, the open trade, but also multilateralism as a way of organizing the global governance and the regional governance. And number three, the commitment to international tasks. First, America is the opposite. Protectionism is the opposite to open trade, and bilateralism is the opposite to multilateralism in many policy fields, from United Nations to WTO to the environment, the COP21, the IMF, the trade regime mentioned by the Gucht, including the poorest and softest regional regime, NAFTA, are put in question. Not only TTIP and TPP, but also NAFTA, so which is absolutely astonishing because it's really a win game for the United States, according to all the comparative research. On the other hand, Macron and Merkel, or Macron and Schulz, may implement the hopes of the Rome Declaration of March 25th about a new start for the European Union. So a new Franco-German leadership is made in a realistic way, realistic because contrary to Hollande and Merkel, Macron knows very well that before he has to do the domestic work of reform, and then he can propose a change in the rules of the Eurozone. And that makes the proposal of Macron much more realistic than the utopia of Hollande, who failed completely under this respect. The Commission White Book, the fifth scenario, differentiated integration, confirmed by the Rome Declaration of March 25th, in favor of differentiated integration, creating hardcore, notably, maybe Mr. Mattelaer will talk about the Europe of defense, which will be the first issue at stake regarding a political signal provided by Europe to the world in terms of more autonomy toward the United States. A more autonomous Europe in terms of defense will not be a military power. Europe remains a civilian power, but more credible as a civilian power through the defense union. And in other respects, the second big hardcore is the Eurozone. The Eurozone can be reformed. Draghi declared a week ago that the crisis is over. Let's take it seriously, as we did in the past, in his role as a leader. I conclude in 2 minutes.
That's why I put it on paper.
And the agenda of consolidating and democratizing the Eurozone is a realistic agenda for the years to come, much more than 1 year before, 1 year ago. And even in terms of immigration policy, a deal is possible because it's clear that the southern country cannot take on their shoulder this terrible challenge, and we have to invent a new form of solidarity. If the solidarity based on qualified majority voting is not working, Vivian Schmidt proposed yesterday a fund for solidarity regarding the immigration policy. I agree with this. Is also the proposal of Mr. Renzi in Italy. I conclude by saying that I don't think that we are going from a geopolitical partnership toward a competition. Tensions are inevitable, but there is this symbiotic economic ties between Europe and Western Europe in particular, and the United States will stop, let me say, too much discontinuity. I think diffuse reciprocity is possible between the two sides of the Atlantic, provided that Europe is strong enough to make the opposite than Trump. No retaliation. If Trump starts by protectionist measures, we have to do exactly the opposite. Openness, readiness to discuss and cooperate, expanding networks in civil society with the Americans is much important than before. And we are happy to have here many American colleagues to have a cooperation with both our institutes, because this is crucial. Second, elite socialization. I think that the approach by Mogherini, Merkel, and others, a kind of learning process to the new American leadership, Tillerson and so on, is in your interest. Continuity is also in your interest, not only in our interest. It's in the interest of the United States not to break the transatlantic cooperation, is also a good approach. Number 3, and that is the crucial point I will stop with, my president, is the time for Europe. Is the time for Europe, not as a single hegemonic power, which is impossible, but as a part of a collective leadership in the global governance. Let's take the opportunity of the United States withdrawing from the Pacific to have to achieve a series of trade negotiations which are ongoing with Japan, with ASEAN, with Vietnam, with China about the investment, the BIT with China, because this is the way how Europe can answer to the challenge of the withdrawal of the United States from the Asia-Pacific, and this shift to the bilateralism, and second, consolidating the relation with the main actors in the Asia-Pacific is crucial for us, not by free trade. That is a very big misunderstanding. When Europe is setting this kind of arrangement, is setting second generation arrangement, including social, environmental, ESDS provision, public procurement, and that is the point where we can civilize the trade relations in many parts of the world, Asia-Pacific first, but also Latin America and Africa. So I conclude, it's a time for Europe, stopping fragmentation, improving global governance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. God bless Mario, always the optimist. I've been asked to talk about transatlantic diplomacy. For those of you who know me, whoever asked me to talk about diplomacy has an acute sense of irony. But crudely, for our purposes today, I see diplomacy as a set of practices operating across borders in political, security, economic and socio-cultural contexts. To understand US-EU diplomatic relations, we need context. Context here means empirical context and normative context. Empirical context I understand as the current state of the liberal international economic, security and political order. And here, much to your surprise, I'm sure, I agree with you rather than my former PhD student, Amitav Acharya. He certainly didn't get his constructivism from me. And I think that Eikenberry's vision of the dangers faced by the liberal order are an accurate reflection of where we stand in that context. The normative context for me is the degree to which these current challenges to the liberal order can be basically fought off, and the degree to which they should be and could be reformed. It's strange for me, I never thought of myself as a liberal, but now more than anything else, I see my strongest aims as an academic to basically defend the global liberal project. Never thought it had come to that.
It's never too late, huh?
No, that's right. And the other thing is, as an emeritus professor, I don't particularly care how I do it. I'm accountable and answerable to no one anymore. So, the big ticket issues. Are we witnessing the end of the liberal order? Are the challenges to globalization reversible? I.e., can we humanize and get globalization right? Because we got it wrong. And if we can't do that, how do we fend off populism and nationalism? It's only as liberalism comes under challenge that we begin to understand what we would lose, what the world would look without it. And when I talk about it, I'm talking about the classical liberalism envisaged by Hume, Bentham and Mill, and in my lifetime as a professor by friends and colleagues like John Ruggie and Bob Kahane. Not the classical liberalism of Hayek, Friedman, Austrian ordo liberals and advocates of the EMH. For sure, the liberal order has its shortcomings. Badly pursued, it can lead to unnecessary wars and economic inequality. But as a vehicle for wealth creation, security, and the promotion of stability and human rights, there aren't many better systems knocking about. This is important for Europe, but it's in this context that transatlantic relations will be difficult to manage. Diplomacy, dealing with the Donald, as I call it, will require a mixed strategy. So, la question du jour, can the liberal international economic and political order survive? Certainly the days of the US underwriting the order as a self-binding hegemon, its great political contribution of the post-World War II era, has clearly gone. As Eikenberry notes, that order is being challenged by a hostile revisionist power. We always expected that. We didn't expect that hostile revisionist power to be in the White House. The liberal order won't survive in its current form. China and Russia will see to that. But that of itself is perhaps no bad thing. the order does need reform. We do need to take account of other interests and rights and other roles and responsibilities, but we need to keep the liberal essence if we can. And I love being able to talk in a normative way rather than as a dispassionate, detached social scientist that I never was. But to secure it, this will require a joined-up Atlantic approach, and we're not likely to get it, I don't think. So la deuxième question du jour is, will Trump undo the liberal order? Now, as Mario points out, the problems predate him. He's a symptom, not a cause. But, and of course, there is empirically to this stage more continuity than change. But Trump's views reflect a disregard for values and norms learned over 70 years. America First instincts will diminish, not support the modern order. His attitude to trade, security, and human rights, for those of you who watched his speech in Saudi Arabia, contradict the very essence of a liberal order. Trump's attitude to multilateralism as a key element of modern diplomatic practice undermines our ability to provide collective action problem solving and global public goods. At the moment, threats are still largely rhetorical, but they are telling. They are destabilising. So we need to do two general things as opposed to specific policy things. The two general things are, we need to relearn the importance of institutions. And secondly, we need to tackle the underlying populist nationalist critique of the global cooperative order. Now, I'm not going to tell people in a room like this the value of institutions. I mean, in broad scale terms, we know what they are. They lower transaction costs. They facilitate agreements, rules, commitments. They enhance compliance. They reduce uncertainty. All the stuff that people like Geijn have been telling us for 25, 30 years. Multilateralism, however, is clearly a fragile institutional form. It needs to be protected and nourished. Moreover, institutions need reform to reflect the interests of all, not just the globalists. And whether we like it or not, the populists were onto something when they posited the problems of a self-serving politico-economic plutocracy. Populism is a problem for us. It's principally domestic, but it's also global, contagious, and self-reinforcing. And there's little doubt that Trump's behaviour emboldens populist nationalist sentiments and practices elsewhere. Duterte, Erdogan, Orban, De Wilders, Farage, etc. Now, we shouldn't panic, but we need to ask how we resist. And we need to ask, to what extent can Europe resist in what we might call a diplomatic sense? We've all seen the European Union global strategy. We've seen Mogherini's joint communique. And the timing of their publication was unfortunate, of course, time of Brexit. But we recognise the existential nature of these threats and the need for European diplomacy to lift its game in this context. Let me finish with a couple of comments on how we deal with Donald Trump. It should not all be about one man. Washington is a complex policy space. But there's an absolutism in Trump's style that sucks out all the oxygen from the discussion of foreign policy. One of my friends calls him an oxygen bandit. There's no room for anyone else to breathe when he's on the rampage. There is this ideological battle between the Bannonites and the globalists in the White House that's destabilising. Reassuring statements after the event do not remove uncertainty in the minds of partners. There's a talent vacuum in the White House and crisis emerging in the Department of State, starved of appointments and departing senior staff. One strategy for Europe could simply be to ride out his presidency, to consider an interregnum, to ignore him for a few years. Tempting, but dangerous. And by the EU, I mean the EU as a 27 here. The Brexit process makes this an infinitely more complex endeavour. But the 27 shouldn't leave it to the Brits. They shouldn't vacate the playing field. So Europe needs to engage. There's a role for good diplomacy from Europe. At the very least, the State Department needs Europe's help. But Europe also needs to put its money where its mouth is. Countries are frantically learning how to deal with this narcissistic figure. Possibly an advantage in some ways that he's as ignorant as he is. It makes him biddable. Some of you may have seen a lovely little piece in the New York Times at the weekend called Rules of Engagement. And I've added to a few of these rules of engagement for dealing with Donald Trump. Learn from Xi Jinping. Learn from the Saudi Arabians. Learn from Theresa May. Ignore what he said in the presidential campaign. Assume little detailed, specific knowledge on any policy area. And as NATO is planning, keep it short and don't use big words. Play to his vanity. Compliment him on the size of the Electoral College, but don't mention the hands. Say nothing about his predecessor. Offer the great deal maker a deal that he can win for the US and himself. Trivial, vaguely satirical, but not irrelevant, I think. So, conclusion. Partnership or competition? We'll have a better idea of that after the dust has settled in Brussels on Friday when he's gone. At least Thursday, comes and goes on Thursday, doesn't he? As the Financial Times pondered a couple of days ago, which Trump will turn up in Brussels? Will it be campaign Trump or will it be the toned down version? What we can say is there's going to be no great ideological meeting of minds. The European leadership is too cynical and too smart. They're not like the Saudis. They're not like him. They should be smart enough to ignore his comments about NATO and start with a tabula rasa. And I'm sure Alexandra will have to say something about this. They need to schmooze him and appeal to his vanity. But they need to offer him a deal. The great deal maker needs to go back with a deal. I don't know what it's going to look like. Maybe some bigger financial commitment to NATO, greater rhetorical support to the war on terrorism, especially post-Manchester. What NATO cannot do is ensure Trump will endorse Article 5 or make the right noises on Russia. And maybe even with the right noises, this doesn't necessarily mean that people will trust him. I've been a political scientist I've held academic appointments for 44 years now. I'm probably the oldest academic in the room. I've lived a life where I have watched the things that I normatively believe in grow. The European project, belief in institutions, belief in the utility of multilateralism. I'll be damned if in my 44th year as an academic, I'm suddenly going to say, well, everything we're seeing is acceptable. We are unlearning what we do and we need to stop. And if that means that we have a fairly testy relationship over the Atlantic over the next few years, then tough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now I give the floor to Mattelaer.
Many thanks, Anne. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm very grateful to the organizers for the invitation to share some thoughts with all of you. And I would also like to compliment the Institut d'études européennes for a great event. The conference lineup, very impressive. So I'm delighted that we can be together here and wrap up with some speculations about what is perhaps yet to come in the transatlantic relationship. Now, my brief is to zoom in on the security dimension of the transatlantic relationship, which has really always been a very contentious topic. We've been there before. It will not go away. Even if Hillary Clinton had now occupied the White House, it would have been also quite contentious. It would have been perhaps more polite, certainly more eloquent, but fundamentally equally contentious. Because at the end of the day, security is a rather serious matter, because if you screw up, people die. And you cannot afford to screw up all that much. The key question when it comes to the broader problem set of solidarity and burden sharing is, of course, are we ready for it alone? Are Europeans ready to face an increasingly dangerous world alone, by themselves, as individual nation states, or by acting together, or do they prefer to continue catering for their security together with the Americans? And if I say an increasingly dangerous world, I do not use that expression lightly, in the sense that we, and by we I mean the security community, have been going through a major paradigm shift in recent years. By and large, during the post-Cold War period, which roughly one can define as starting in the early 1990s and running up to 2014 perhaps, it was a world in which our ministries of defense in Europe were by and large focusing on expeditionary crisis management. First Yugoslavia, then further afield, Lebanon, Afghanistan, you name it. So the principal task for ministries of defense was to provide contributions to expeditionary missions that were always further away from the European continent, and in many cases it increasingly became token contributions in a larger effort. And that world in which crisis management was central for our defense establishments, it came to an end in 2014, and we have entered into a universe where large-scale war has again become imaginable, not necessarily likely to occur tomorrow here in Brussels or elsewhere in the EU, but certainly imaginable. One can actually say, well, in the Middle East, there is already a fair amount of war unfolding today, and it has major spillover effects into Europe. There is also a lot of concern over the internal security situation that has some links with that phenomenon. I guess most people in the room are Belgian. Well, 600 Belgians went to join the jihadi fight. A third of them are dead. A third of them are still there, and a third have returned. There are over 2,000 Belgian citizens on the watch list today as potentially likely to commit violent crimes. I mean, there are all significant problem sets, but the biggest problem set is, of course, the one that relates to Russia. From a Belgian perspective, Russia is far away. In Central and Eastern Europe, populations feel very differently, and in effect, as Russia annexed territory in 2014, defense planners are again thinking, well, if Russia is grabbing land from other countries, we should perhaps prepare for that. That whole changing security situation is feeding in what is called the NATO defense planning process, which is essentially a policy cycle in which the political level defines what are the aims and objectives of the alliance. There is one very important one. If the alliance gets attacked, it must be able to defend itself. Then the generals draw up the list of all the means they require to fulfill those aims and objectives. So the generals say, we need a lot of tanks, we need a lot of airplanes, and so on and so forth. And then it gets really interesting. In the alliance, the targets of everything that is needed need to be distributed across all the allies. And that process has essentially been unfolding during the previous months. The decision-making mechanism is consensus -1. So the alliance actually decides to impose targets, even if individual allies do not want to accept that. But the alliance says, well, if we need those resources, everyone needs to chip in, and that is what is needed. So during the special meeting later this week, several allies, including Belgium, will get a lot of anger and criticism thrown into their direction. Because the Americans will say, well, we do not have infinite resources. We need our resources elsewhere, in Asia, in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. So within the burden-sharing debate in the alliance, Europeans must do more. But I actually want to add some nuance to that, because one then gets the impression Europeans need to do this or that because the Americans tell them to do so. Actually, not quite. At the end of the day, it is their own security that is at stake, and that is very nicely illustrated if you, for instance, look at the defense debate in Sweden. Sweden hasn't known war for 200 years, is arguably as pacifist a country as you can get, currently led by a social democrat government. What is happening in Sweden? The defense budget is going up. They just reintroduced conscription, and the size of the armed forces is increasing. And they do so because, well, they cannot count on the Americans to chip in because they're not in the alliance. So at the end of the day, the real problem set is, well, you can abandon the alliance, but then the size of the problem, namely to defend against all the threats that are out there, and that really means in today's world, dealing with potential Russian aggression and a range of other issues, well, instead of only paying for half of the pie, then Europeans would need to pay for the full pie by themselves. And that is something that is not always recognized as articulately. And to just end on a remark on the European defense debate at present, there may well be a window of opportunity that is presenting itself if there is also a major push for further integration of the economic and monetary union, because at the end of the day, a currency and an army are the two most fundamental manifestations of the power of the state. But we also need to watch out, because there is a great danger that we mistake the Potemkin villages that sometimes pass as European defense for the real thing. Here in Brussels, everyone gets excited about the battle groups, but a battle group, well, that is exactly what is on the streets of Brussels today. Perhaps not playing a very useful role, but that's another debate. What you're seeing in Brussels Central Station and elsewhere, that is a battle group. That is not a European defense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. So, as we are running out of time, I would propose to take maximum 4 questions, and I will ask all people to be very short in their questions or comments. So 4 questions maximum.
Hello, my name is Álvaro Leart. I am a researcher here at the Institute of European Studies. Thank you very much for the presentations. They were very interesting. I have a question for Mr. de Gucht. I was surprised by your statement that the TTIP negotiations failed due to the lack of reciprocity with the Obama administration in regards to public procurement. And I was wondering, would you be the trade commissioner right now? Would you restart the TTIP negotiations if that would be solved? And if you would do so, would you do it in a bilateral or in a multilateral, including other countries in the agreement? Thank you.
You mean TTIP?
Yes.
A second question?
Yeah, thank you all very much for your comments. And my question is for all of you, but I start off with Mario, whom Richard said is very optimistic. And I generally tend to be as well, but for once I'm going to be very pessimistic.
So you and I will agree for once.
We will. probably. But you know, the big question is, why was continental Europe different? And actually, let's not forget Poland and Hungary already in terms of a drift to anti-liberal democracy. But maybe the difference is just for the moment. What happens if Macron fails to reform to make the country grow again? What if Marine is back and then with a party with a new name? So what happens if in 5 years' time we get a Marine Le Pen? And what if Merkel, rather than setting up what we assume is a grand coalition with the SPD after the next elections, is Liberal Democrats and Greens and a much more right-leaning group? So there, you know, what happens to essentially Europe if it becomes more populist? And then let's believe, I mean, I'd love to believe that the international liberal order is going to continue. And on my optimistic days, I think, yes, it will. But on the pessimistic ones, if we believe what Trump says, we watch his tweets rather than what he's been doing, then I think the big question, and this is for all of you, can the EU go it alone without its main partner to spread Western values on terms of trade, human rights, environment, etc., and also in terms of defense and security? Can it manage without the US? Can it take over NATO, which is what has been discussed, I think, in recent years in terms of defense and security? Is the EU able to step up to the plate, especially if it turns populist?
Thank you. Is there a third question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question for Alexander. Mattelaer, it left me quite sad to hear that Sweden pops up its defense spending so much to potentially protect itself from Russia. So my first question is, how much money does Sweden have to spend to be a counterweight to the Russian army, so to be really a threat towards Putin? The second question is, doesn't that pour oil into the fire of Putin's argumentation? We are threatened by the Western alliances, so we need to be hard. So this neo-realist thinking. And the third question, does Sweden compromise the money it spends on military defense on other places or other areas which could be much more useful to increase security and safety for all the Swedish?
Thank you. And a fourth and last question. Antoine.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, basically a question to Alexander. I personally don't think that we need to go to the 2% GDP as Trump is asking at NATO, but I do think that there's a lot of reshuffling that can be done within the EU. And just to kind of go a bit overboard, do you see it happening, and maybe also question to Karel, do you see it happening within your lifetimes that there would be a European army rather than the Belgian, French, German, etc. that we have now? Because there's a lot of weight, a lot of dead weight in that adds to the GDP, which could be used for other means. And this has been popped up a long time before with the defense union and so forth, but it's kind of resurfacing now, but I don't know in how far it's realistic.
Thank you very much. So I propose to answer in the same order as your presentation. Professor de Gucht first.
Yes, thank you very much. First on public procurement within TTIP. As I tried to explain, it is essential because you need to find an equilibrium. You need to find a deal, you know. And when you look at what are the offensives of the Europeans, amongst them are, for example, geographical indications, and the Americans don't like it at all. They don't even know it. You know, they have never heard of it. They protect those intellectual property rights with trademarks and so on by the big corporations, and not with geographical indications. So it's not a very useful discussion. Public procurement is important because we are probably about the biggest actors in that respect internationally. And you need that to counterbalance what are the defensives in Europe, and they are mainly about agriculture. So if you can't match that, then I think it's very difficult to get to any agreement. Can you revive this negotiation? I don't know. I mean, I think for the time being, Europe has no special interest trying to do so. Because if you were trying to revive it now, it would be at a lower level. So I would say it's better to continue working on regulatory approximation and see what happens in a couple of years, instead of now trying to revive it at a lower level just on tariffs. Because if you do that, you will never find an agreement across the Atlantic. So you could spend a lot of energy in that without any result. I would rather focus on Asia. By the way, we have an agreement with Vietnam. That's already done. It's a done deal. The same with Singapore. The same with Korea. So I would say that probably before the end of the year we also have an agreement with Japan. So that's what I would do. I would concentrate on that. And by the way, we are instilling, and that's partly answer to your question, for example, human rights and sustainability into it. And if you look at the very recent opinion by the European Court of Justice on Singapore, they have said that we have the exclusive competence as a European Union to make engagements, for example, on sustainability, on human rights, etc., on all the moral elements, because they are the political goal of the European Union. It went very far. It's a very, very pro-European opinion that they have been giving, and it gives us a lot of room to include this in our negotiations, which is also very important to get the agreement, for example, of the European Parliament that is, and rightly so, insisting on this. So we have some room there. Now, if Macron fails, you never know with politicians, you know. He is not going to reform completely France. I mean, you cannot expect him to do so. I would rather say that he will try to do it, yes. And he is much more realistic than, for example, Fillon was. Fillon said 500,000 bureaucrats less. He says 120,000. No, if he ends up with 100, it would be a success. So he is more moderate, in fact, in what he is proposing than many others. But Germany will have to come to his help, you know. So the idea that Macron first has to reorganize everything in France and then there can be a deal with Germany, that's not how the political world evolves, you know. So what Germany will have to do is do something about the imbalance in its balance of payments, the positive imbalance, but we have to do something. So they will have to come to the help of France, and if they are smart and intelligent, they will do so. But they could also be rather stubborn. So I hope that in the next government, Mr. Schäuble is not there anymore, and that they have a more open approach. Because without that open approach, Macron cannot deliver. You know, he would never be able to deliver. So I was talking about the values in trade, and you know, NATO. Can we take over NATO? I wouldn't do it, but I believe that before you really reach an agreement on contributions, you would need to have a serious discussion on the nature of NATO itself, you know. Because what the Americans are asking us is that we contribute more, but in practice, NATO is completely dominated by the United States. So it's either or. I mean, if they give up their domination, their dominance in NATO, then I think we should be ready to talk about considerably more money. But the idea, we will contribute more, but it still will be what the United States is thinking that is decided. That won't work, you know. I mean, I've been present on several summit meetings of NATO and for years on the ministerial meeting. This is really an organization that is completely dominated by the US, you know. Okay, if they want to do that, let them also pay for it. If they want to open the discussion and also seriously look at European security concepts, okay, then we should be ready to contribute more. But it's either or, you know. So you can't have the cake and eat it, you know.
Thank you very much. Mario?
Thank you very much, everybody. I learned a lot, but thank you in particular, Vivian Schmidt, for this crucial question. It's not a matter of optimism and pessimism, in my opinion. It's a matter of be consequent in our analysis. I accept the concept, I'm very happy that you agree about that, the concept of crisis of the international liberal order. But in the Acharya understanding, which I share more than the Eikenberry, which is catastrophic under this respect, much more pessimist than you, and so because it's really the breakdown of the system he believed in. In case of Acharya, it means, like in my understanding, that the next post-liberal global order will have much more regionalism than before. That is a crucial point. So it will be less dominated by global negotiation and much more by regional and interregional arrangement, as we have had in the last period. So, and not only, but the regionalism to survive has to be much more political than before, less economical and more political. That has to do with the future of the European Union, in my analysis. So this is the challenge. So it's not only for us. ASEAN is confronted to this stake to become more political in organizing the space. ASEAN +1, ASEAN +3, ASEAN +6. The RCEP is a big project. So this has to do with the future of the European Union by reorganizing the continent, including the role of the UK by concentric circles, where we need a political hardcore. And it comes the second point. In my opinion, Macron and Merkel may be able to do it, to realize it to some extent. This is the point. You ask me whether in 2023 Macron will fail and Le Pen will come in office. I am not the crystal ball, but I've enough talking with the period 2017, 2022. And for this period, I think this card can be played, including the two messages which has been mentioned: strengthening the Eurozone and democratizing the Eurozone. Without democratization, the Eurozone doesn't work. And second, strengthening.
Excuse me, because you also said it in your first intervention, Mario.
Yes, I like the discussion.
And
yes.
Me too. But what do you mean by democratization of the Eurozone?
I presented yesterday a paper on that. I will
that's
send
possible.
you. Okay. 3 points: parliamentary legitimacy, a parliamentary committee. National Parliament association to the legitimacy process, COSAC and so on, and social legitimacy by a structured dialogue with the social partners. But it's a long paper. I cannot summarize it. So it's not a waste of time, like Wolfgang Streeck said.
These 3 points mean that I'm in complete disagreement with you, huh?
Yes, I don't know if I remember the way you dealt the TTIP without transparency, without democratic control. I can understand. But so we have different priorities
for the bar.
So I respect very much you started the TTIP. However, we have had a wave of protestations so strong that we would never have, with more transparency since the beginning and with more democratic participation. Sorry for saying it. So if we start TTIP again, we have to start with another trend, with transparency, democratic participation, or we stop this kind of interregional agreements. So, sorry for that, but I know that your successor, Malmström, is doing a very important endeavor to associate the European Parliament, national parliaments, and also non-governmental organizations. So we have hope that the way you opened with the negotiation at TTIP will be continued in an efficient way. And this is one of the, to conclude, if this again, this Franco-German again works in defense and Eurozone democratization and consolidation, in this case, Europe can really play a global role by asserting high-level standards in trade negotiation. And I like the second-generation trade negotiation. Is an expression liked very much by our Canadian partners. Second generation includes the social dimension, environmental dimension, the public procurement dimension, ESDS, and so on. This is the crucial way how European Union can be a civilian power for the years to come by setting its own international idea of international relations, and taking also the legacy of what the United States did very well after the World War II. Multilateralism, defense of human rights, democracy in the world, and so on. This is the time for Europe.
Thank you. Professor Higgot.
I'll be very short, 2 points. One that I didn't pick up. Mario, the United States is not exiting Asia. It's performing very badly in Asia. It's setting itself up to fail in Asia. And the beneficiary will be the Chinese, who have shown massive sophisticated diplomacy in the economic domain. So Amitav's got a point about the regionalization, but the idea that the US won't be one of the principal players in the Asian context is, for me, not on. And the idea that Europe can marginally take advantage on these things, but it's not going to supplant. It's just a joke. I mean, I've lived in Australia for 20 odd years, and when Australians talk about themselves as being part of Asia, they've got as much chance of being part of Asia as Turkey has of being part of Europe. Economically, they're very close to it, but culturally, the differences are massive. I want to go to Vivian's comment on populism, because I think she's bang on here. I spend quite a lot of time living in Budapest at the moment. I've become a close observer of Orbán, given Diane's relationships with the Central European University. They're not going away. Populism's had a couple of setbacks, but this is not the end of populism as a political phenomena in Europe, and it's become extremely sophisticated. It's disruptive politics, and its disruptive use of technologies, or if you like, its brilliant use of technologies, has meant that small groups, populist agendas can flourish. And then when you add in that horrible ingredient of billionaires who think that they can, through the use of technology, begin to control politics, I'm thinking of Mercer and Breitbart and these kinds of people, there is a new form of politics taking place. And unless, and this is my last point, unless the so-called global elites, the globalizers who have benefited from globalization, rather than those that have suffered from, unless they can recognize that we need to find compensatory mechanisms for the losers from the global policy processes, we are not going to stymie the populists. I mean, Trump is a Pluto populist. He's not I mean, every policy he's brought in so far has been to the disadvantage of the people who voted for him. I don't want to call them dumb schmucks, but I mean, it's, you know, I mean, Hillary got into trouble for being dismissive of them, so we don't do it. But my point here is simply that we are not, unless we address, I mean, the major rift between what we might call the state and civil society, the decline of that social bond that gave people a sense of buy-in, unless that is reinstated, then we're going to live for a long time with this populist nationalist agenda in Europe.
Thank you. Alexander?
Vivian, can the EU go it alone in defending the liberal democratic order and take over? In theory, yes, but it will not be easy, and it will not materialize very quickly, because a lot needs to be done before we get there. And ultimately, this requires that Europeans stick together when the shit really hits the fan. and that is not self-evident. In a recent burden-sharing debate at ambassadors level, Belgium made the case we need a significant chunk of our security resources to deal with counter-terrorism. You know, our airport just got blown up. And another ambassador from an EU country said, yeah, but that's your problem. That's not our problem. And of course, you only have limited resources. We now have a bunch of logisticians together with the Bundeswehr in Lithuania. If something happens there and our guys call Brussels, we need reinforcements, the answer will be, sorry, the reinforcements are patrolling through the streets of Brussels. And that gives those people who are there a very, very uncomfortable feeling. So it's really about accepting the notion of having a collective destiny as Europeans, which I hope we will arrive there, but it's not self-evident. The Swedish case, it's not easy for them either, but they're taking those decisions for a reason, and having the Russians practice nuclear bombing runs on your capital and Russian submarines showing up in Swedish territorial waters. At some point in time, the Swedish got worried enough to do what they're now doing. Will this infuriate the Russians? Of course. Of course, the Russians will complain. And we all know the Russians always tell the truth, and they would not dare trying to influence our domestic political processes, right? Yes, this costs money, and therefore it's a very unpleasant discussion. But at the end of the day, if you want to have a guns versus butter argument, there's also the point to be made: no welfare state has ever existed in a vacuum where there is no one providing security. You cannot enjoy your pension if the world is on fire. And you can achieve greater cost effectiveness by cooperating, but then you also need to really trust one another, which is not always easy. And at the end of the day, if the world gets
I hope that's not an iconic statement.
And if the world takes a turn for the worse, then sometimes there are no easy options. So it's unpleasant, but here we are. We have been decreasing security expenditure for decades, pretty much across Europe. Did that produce a world free of risk and free of danger? No. What is the the long-run historical tendency? Well, if you want peace, you need to prepare for war, because thereby you deter it. What the alliance is now doing, and what the Europeans can also do by themselves, is essentially preventing war by making sure it has a high cost for the other side. I'll stop here. Thank you.